Now, what we're going to be talking about in this video is public speaking and fear of public speaking. It's based on material on a book called Present Yourself in Public Speaking. In the book, the author makes this interesting distinction between the outer world of public speaking and the inner world of public speaking. So I want to describe each, although we're going to be focusing on the inner world. In the outer world of public speaking, what she's referring to is what an audience hears and what an audience sees, right? What they can see or hear when you're talking. So your voice, for example, right? A strong, loud voice denotes confidence. A quiet, sort of timid voice denotes sort of a lack of confidence. The cadence at which somebody speaks, how quickly or how slowly they speak, can send messages as well. If you speak quickly, that can imply nervousness, but it can also denote excitement. Sometimes it can be seen as a lack of confidence, like you're just trying to get it over with, right? And then there's nonverbal communication. There's your posture. You know, when people stand upright, that generally denotes confidence. When people are slouching, it tends to denote a lack of confidence, like you're trying to shrink and make yourself as small as possible. Shifting weight from one leg to another while you're talking, it sort of makes you look less balanced and then gives the impression that you're not balanced or solid. Crossing your legs can have the same effect. And then eye contact. Eye contact denotes confidence as well, that you're very clear about what you're saying. The inner world of public speaking is the stuff that goes on inside your head. And as it turns out, to speak well in public, you have to deal with that inner voice. You have to deal with what we call the inner critic. And that requires, to learn how to be a good public speaker, it requires self-reflection. It requires honesty. It requires challenging yourself, and it requires courage. Now, admittedly, it's weird to take a class where the professor says that part of the class is being courageous. But it's important to understand that people frequently mistake the meaning of courage. They don't understand it. Courage is not the absence of fear, right? The absence of fear sometimes is an indication of stupidity, right? If somebody jumps out of a plane without a parachute, they aren't courageous, they're stupid. Courage only exists when fear is present. No one has ever been called courageous because they made a grilled cheese sandwich, right? That is not something that requires tremendous courage. I mean, unless somebody has some irrational fear of making grilled cheese sandwiches. Courage is refusing to be paralyzed by fear. It's doing something despite the presence of fear. And so I'm asking you to be courageous, but I'm also asking that you understand what it is you're afraid of when you say that you're afraid of speaking in public. You see, people who say that they fear public speaking actually fear something else. It's not fear of public speaking per se. Now you might be thinking, no, it's fear of public speaking, Phil. Well, consider this. I would suggest to you that it's fear of public judgment. You're afraid that if you stumble over your words, people are going to think you're dumb. You're afraid of saying something that's like inaccurate, like factually inaccurate. I know that when I first started teaching at UCLA, this was like my biggest fear, that I would make some claim about the presidency or Congress, and the student would stand up and say, actually, that's not true. There's fear of being boring, right? Fear that you're going to be saying something and you're going to see a couple people in the front row like yawning, like, my God, get this over with. Looking awkward, nervous, fear that people are going to say, like, you don't belong up here. Why are you in front of us talking? Now, people feel these fears before, after, and during the time that they speak. Right before you start speaking, when you know you're getting ready to go up to speak, your heart rate increases, your blood pressure goes up, your breath gets shallow. And then when you're speaking, it can feel like an out-of-body experience, like you're in the audience watching yourself. Sometimes when people are done speaking, it's like they go blank. They have no memory of what happened. And then after, the heart rate can still be up, the blood pressure can still be racing, breath starts to return to normal, and that's when people start imagining or thinking about every mistake, whether or not it's a mistake, real or imagined, that they made. That's what's going on. Fear of public judgment. Now, to deal with this, let me tell you something that you already know. Everyone has an inner critic. Everyone has that voice in their head saying things to them, criticizing them when they're speaking in public. You have one. I have one. Although less so over time. I've learned to deal with it, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this class. But let me tell you some things you might not know. We tend to believe our inner critic. Even when the criticisms are unfounded, even when the criticisms are just mean, we tend to accept it. Or at a minimum, if we don't accept it, we assume that other people feel that way as well. And here's something that's really weird about this. We would not tolerate the same things being said to a friend. We would not tolerate the same things being said to a teammate. But when they're said to us, we're like, oh, okay. If somebody said those kind of things that our inner critic says to us about someone else, we jump in. Hey, that's not cool. Back the hell off. Even if some of the criticisms had some validity, we'd say back the hell off, and then we'd say them, but we'd say them in a nice way, in a supportive way. No, you weren't boring. Ignore the inner critic. It's a complicated topic, but maybe you can think of a more simplified way to present it. Now, in this class, you're certainly going to get honest criticism. That's part of the class, but it's going to be constructive. Our inner critic is not constructive. Our inner critic is a jackass. So what can we do about our inner critic? Well, it's important to do something because if that voice is going on in your head all the time as you're speaking, what it's going to do is it's going to get between you and your audience. It's going to be hard to connect with your audience when you have this voice in your head telling you that you're screwing up over and over again. It'd be like having a set of headphones on where somebody's like just repeating criticisms of you while you're trying to give a speech. So how do we do it? How do we deal with it? Well, first, no, you can't ignore it. It cannot be ignored. You try and ignore it, and that's probably how you've usually dealt with it in the past, if you've even addressed it at all. It just keeps coming back. And it's really, really good because it knows your deepest, darkest secrets. And that's why it can get really mean sometimes. So what do? We have to listen to it. We have to record what it says. And at the right time, we respond to what it says. Well, what does that look like? In this class, you're going to be keeping something that we used to call an inner critic journal, but a lot of students said that they didn't like it, so I think this time around, we're going to call it self-reflection. And let me explain the process. Step number 1 is as you're giving a speech, whether it's in the Model UN, in another class, if you belong to a club and you're speaking in a club, if you're speaking at a church or your synagogue or mosque, wherever you happen to be speaking publicly, right? The first thing you need to do is listen to what the inner critic is saying. Now focus on your presentation, right? Focus on what your speech is supposed to be about. Don't pretend it's not there, but you don't want to give it all your attention. But don't try and pretend it's not there. Don't ignore it. Then, step 2, keep a record of what it's saying. You need to write it down or type it somewhere. Right? In the past, I handed out books with lined paper, and students would write it in there. But their writing was often illegible, so it was a little irritating. Alternatively, just start a document on whatever device you're using. Call it your self-reflection. If you like Inner Critic Journal, you can call it that. Just save a document on your device that you use to keep a record of the things your inner critic says. And even record the really mean things it says. If it says you're boring, if it says you're a fraud, if it says no one cares, if it says you're stupid, if it says you're ugly, if it says you're dumb, it doesn't matter, write it down. That can be hard. That can be really hard. And in the past, students have started writing these things down, and the next thing you know, other kinds of things that they hadn't thought about for a long time, incidents that happened when they were in elementary school or in middle school, start coming back to them. The more honest you are, the easier, the more you'll get from this exercise. Now, what you can do is, if you want to, you can share these things with your friends, share them with a teammate, or you can share them with me. What I can tell you is that I've seen a lot of these. I'm not shocked by anything. And you have my word that I will never discuss your self-reflection with anyone. If you feel comfortable talking to me about it, and you're not required to, you certainly can. The next part is the most important part of this exercise. Respond to the criticisms in writing. Again, you can write it by hand, you can do it on a document, and tell the truth. If your inner critic is saying things that aren't true, explain why they aren't true, and write to your inner critic, write directly to it. You kept saying I was boring. Well, maybe I was a little boring, but that's a complicated topic. Sometimes you have to explain boring topics to get to the more important and interesting parts. And that's what I did. I explained this, but later on we got to this part and it was really interesting. That's the way to address it. Now, periodically, I may ask to see your inner critic journal. If you're really concerned about that, I'll just look it over to make sure that it's done. But if you don't feel comfortable with me reading it, and I hope you will over time, I will try and respect that. Just do me a favor. Just don't write BS. Right? Sometimes students do this and they just write stuff to write stuff. The only way this works is if you're really honest, if you really examine what's going on in your head. Now, what's the point of this exercise? Your inner critic can be mean, but the thing is, it isn't usually diverse. It hits on the same criticisms over and over and over again. When you respond to those criticisms in writing, whether you're handwriting them or you're typing them, it becomes easier and easier to recall them from memory. So when your inner critic starts attacking you during a speech, you can recall the responses and quiet the voice. If it's made criticisms of the past that are valid, you've made adjustments and I've tried to respond to it, and you can respond by saying, I've already done that. What will happen over time is the voice will get quieter and quieter. And that's the goal, not to eliminate the inner critic. It's always there. It's probably good that it's there as long as it's being constructive. The goal is to quiet it so that we can communicate more effectively.